Thanks for joining in and welcome to the Irrigation webinar series. Today's webinar is the second in a sub-series titled Who Got the Irrigation This Season and Why? Sharing Southern Murray-Darling Water. This webinar is about the water allocation processes and key events affecting water availability. My name is Rob O'Connor. I work with the irrigation team in Agriculture Victoria based at Echuca. I need to let you know that you have been muted and that this webinar is being recorded and it will be distributed in a few days' time to people who have registered for this webinar. If you have any technical issues, please contact John Paulette using the chat function in Zoom. Select host for technical issues, or you can use John's email address or phone number on the screen there. John's our technical manager today and is based at Tatura with AgVic in the irrigation team. If you have any questions, please use the chat function and select co-host. We will have questions at the end of the webinar and hopefully during the webinar, if we're tracking well for time. At the end of the webinar, there will be a survey that comes up on your screen. If you could complete that, that would be much appreciated. We are aiming to finish at 2 o'clock. I would just like to thank our supporters, so to the CMAs along the Murray River, to Goulburn Murray Water and Lower Murray Water, Regional Development Victoria, D&G Consulting, Agriculture Victoria, and all the farming groups and organisations that have promoted us, have helped us to promote these webinars. This webinar today is looking at the different irrigation allocation processes across the Southern Connected Basin, and some of the key issues affecting water availability, including carryover, dam spills, and unregulated flows. Just a reminder that the first webinar is available as a recording on the Extension Oz Irrigating Ag website, shown on the screen there. And our next webinar in this sub-series is on in a fortnight's time, and it will discuss water trade limits and how they work, impact of environmental water allowance on irrigation allocations, and an irrigation situation and outlook. What we're trying to achieve in this webinar sub-series from a practical point of view is to help participants to better understand the influence of water policy and key events on Southern Basin water availability, and as a result of that, being better able to anticipate upcoming irrigation water availability in future seasons, and to make earlier and more informed decisions to manage variable water allocations. I would like to introduce our speaker, Garry Smith. Garry is a director at DG Consulting and has over 30 years experience in different roles related to irrigation and water management across the Southern Basin. So over to you, Garry.
Thanks, Rob. Great pleasure to be here today. Thanks, everyone. So yeah, let's dive straight into it. There's a fair bit to cover and we'd like to make sure that there's some time for questions at the end. So we're really going to talk, as Rob's outlined, about water allocation policy and those key things around irrigation allocations and how they're made, carryover and what that means, and some of the carryover in different systems and how they're similar are they and how different they are. A little bit on dam spills and a bit of a touch on unregulated flows and supplementary water use. So we're going to cover plenty of areas, and I'll aim to focus on the key principles and some of the big issues to provide an overall understanding of the issues, rather than we'll try and not go into the minute detail of everything, but try and provide some pointers if you are interested where you can find further information. So let's dive into it. Irrigation allocations and how they're made. So let's start with the basic question: what are allocations? So we start with the water access entitlement, which is really the fundamental sort of building block. That's an ongoing entitlement to a share of the water available in your water system. They're called watershed in Victoria. They're called water access licenses in New South Wales, and so on. Allocation is the volume of water that's actually available for use, trade, or carryover in the current season. And the seasonal determination, which is what's known as Victoria, that's the process, or an available water determination is what it's called in New South Wales, or a seasonal allocation in South Australia. That's the process for assessing what are the volumes of water actually available to be credited to allocation accounts to water entitlement holders in the current under the current seasonal conditions. So if you like, think of it as a water share is a share, it's a bit like owning a share in a business, and the allocation is a bit like the annual dividend from that share. So that's the return from your share in the undertaking each year. So allocation is real water actually available, and it's in an account that you can call on or trade or carry over. And the water access entitlement is an ongoing right to a share. Just to illustrate that, how that works, certainly for Victorian attendees, what we're showing here on this slide is just a little schematic of how you might want to think about this. So you've got a high reliability water share. You might have a low reliability water share as well. They're linked up to an allocation account, which are also known as AVAs. So in this example, credits going into the account are the seasonal determination, the allocations available under high reliability. So if we've got 100%, there's 100 megalitres from that 100 megalitre water share, so fully available. And in this example, which is clearly not a real seasonal example, there's a 50% low reliability water share allocation in the Goulburn. On a 48 megalitre share, that will give you 24 megalitres. And in this case, this user has traded in 10 megalitres of allocation from someone else. So it's got a balance of 134 megalitres, and then has used 30 megalitres applied to his property for irrigation. So there's 30 megalitres of use debited, and has also chosen at a later date to trade out 14 megalitres. So total debits of 44 megalitres, giving a balance of 90. So very much like similar to a bank account in some ways, that shows where you're going, and the water's credited into your allocation account. Okay, so let's then move on to how is an allocation actually made. So this is the Victorian seasonal determination process. So in concept, it's relatively simple. Assess what's the resource available, and then assess the commitments to supply to determine how much water can be allocated to new entitlements. And the same basic principles apply to all systems, but we'll use the Victorian Goulburn system as an example. So same principles apply to all systems and across South Australia and New South Wales. However, clearly the details do vary from system to system, and particularly state to state, with different water products and different water sharing rules. So when we look at assessing the water resource available, clearly one of the first things is what's the water in storages, and also what are the forecast inflows. Now, there are some different assumptions that can apply, and Victoria uses a 2-year planning period to do that. So when we're looking at allocations when we haven't reached 100% allocation for high reliability water shares, there's not a lot of water, there's not a lot of additional reserves in storage. So you need to be quite careful that the water that is announced can be delivered. So Resource managers look at the water in transit in the catchment and say that's definitely going to flow into the storage. We can definitely count on that water. And that's usually water that will flow in over about a 6-week period. Once we get to 100% of high reliability watersheds allocations, we move to a longer term inflow forecast looking at water that might flow into the storage over a 2-year planning period that's got a 99% probability of being exceeded. So if you like, what water we're getting in the 1% of driest years, which is certainly pretty reliable given that there's already a strong base built up through 100% of high reliability watersheds allocation. So there is some water in the bank. So once that's done, we start moving into that 99% probability of exceedance inflow assumption and looking at those inflows over the coming 2 years up until April of the following season. We also need to account for water owed from other systems. So, for example, in the Murray, that could be intervalley transfer accounts that from a tributary like the Goulburn or the Loddon or Campaspe, that's water's owed to the Murray and will be a resource available to be called on. So in terms of commitments to supply, the first ones up that need to be put away and made sure they're covered are river losses, evaporation from storages, and also dead storage, the volume in the reservoirs below the outlet levels that can't be accessed readily. So you need to have those in place to make sure you can run the system and deliver whatever water's available. Also look at water owed to other systems. So in the case of the Goulburn, that water might be water that's as a result of prior trades in the previous year. That might be water in the intervalley transfer account that's owed to the Murray, for example. Also need to make allowance for things like minimum passing flows that have to be released from storages, even if there's no demand, or passed at the end of system flows. Also need to have regard for the water that's already allocated, that's sitting in storages. You can't reallocate that again. So let's look at the volume of carryover still available and any unused current allocation from the current season. So that's not available. When you look at all those things, that allows for an assessment of the additional volume available for new allocations to entitlements. And that's allocated based on the priorities specified in the water sharing arrangement. So in Victoria, that's in the bulk entitlement documents. And that basically the priorities, high reliability water shares in year 1 and irrigation district losses allowances at the same time. And then system operating water and high reliability water shares in year 2, and then move on to low reliability water shares in the current year if there's sufficient resources coming in throughout the season. So as I said, those rules are all in the bulk entitlement orders for the various systems. In Victoria, the seasonal determination process is undertaken by the Northern Victorian Resource Manager, and GMW has been appointed as the Northern Victorian Resource Manager. So they make all of the seasonal determinations for Northern Victoria. In terms of the broad philosophies underlying it, that's the sort of the mechanics we've talked about, but the broad philosophies are really resource managers trying to allocate the maximum volume possible as early as possible to give certainty to water users, but that's got to be subject to ensuring that they protect the reliability for year 2 high reliability entitlements, and also ensure that the announced allocations can be actually delivered from the resources available. So clearly one thing that resource managers don't want to do is ever have to reduce an announced allocation. So the other important thing that happens is in building those reserves for to make sure we can run the system and operate it in year 2 is when we're allocating high reliability water shares in year 1, when the allocation reaches 30%, from between 30% and 50% allocation levels, half of the inflows go to improving the current season's allocation, and half are put away towards reserves to get started in the following year. So there's a little bit of water ready to prime the system and get it operating from the start of the year, which is really important to ensure that there's a small starting allocation for things like DNS and essential water, and also that the system can be operated at the start of year 2 if it's dry conditions, and that'll enable the delivery of those limited allocations, but importantly, the carryover that individuals may have put away, so that it ensures that that actually can be used as a risk management because it can be delivered. Let's just look at a little bit of a graphic that demonstrates how that works. So you can see there that the water is sitting there from the previous year's carryover. If we think of this bucket as the storage and as inflows are coming in and filling up the bucket, this is how the resource managers allocate water, and this is the priority they give to it. So the next, as we said, is water required to operate storages and river systems, then the distribution systems and irrigation channels in the network, in the irrigation networks, and then we move into high reliability watersheds. But in that 30 to 50% allocation gap, half of the water is going to new allocations and half system operating requirements for the next season. Then we get to 100% of high reliability in this year. And there's a little bit of a gap while further inflows are reserved for high reliability water allocations for next season and operating and cover those key operating water. And then we move into low reliability watersheds in the current year. Okay, the other tool and the other way that can help understand the each time there's an assessment of allocations, the Northern Victorian Resource Manager puts out a water balance diagram, and here's an example of one. These are all available on the Northern Victorian Resource Manager's website. You can see that address there. It's nvrm.net.au, and there's a lot of data, information and explanations on how allocations are made and some of the other things we'll talk about today. So I'd really commend that site to you as a great source of information. But you can see here, this is graphically showing what's the available resource. So all of those things we talked about, water in store, forecast inflows, and some of the supplements from other systems like the Campaspe and the Loddon, etc. And here it is for the Goulburn. This is an example of the commitments. Again, dead storage, some of that very high reliability entitlements, river losses, some water for IBT and obligations owed to other systems. Then we get into some of the early reserve and remaining allocated volume, noting that we'd already reached 100% of high reliability allocation in the Goulburn by the 1st of April when this was done. So it's looking at, this is the water that's already been allocated against that but is unused. And so there's the water, the further commitments for 2023. So those sort of water balance diagrams that show the water available and the commitments against it give you a lot of information, and they're updated very regularly. So I urge you to have a look at that. So that's how it's done in Victoria. Let's take a little look at how it's done in some other jurisdictions and see what are the where are they similar and where do they differ. So let's turn to New South Wales, and rather than a seasonal determination, they're called an available water determination. And as I said earlier, it's a similar general approach, but they use a couple of key differences, and one of those is the different inflow assumptions. So rather than the water in transit, when there's lower allocations, rather than the water in transit to the storage, which is guaranteed to arrive in storage, New South Wales uses the minimum historical inflows prior to the commencement of their water sharing plans, which started in 2004. And that's roughly equivalent to the 99% probability of exceedance. But what that, which helps identify the water that's available, and some of that water will have to come in, across the whole path of the season. So the assumption there is that it will follow something like the general pattern of winter-spring inflows. A couple of risks there with that New South Wales also acknowledged that we did see in the Millennium Drought that there were, particularly 06-07, we had inflows lower than those minimum historical inflows prior to 2004. So a recurrence of those extreme inflows would mean that would put some of the ability to actually deliver that water in a little bit at risk. And also it's relying on that water coming in at a timing that precedes or matches the extent of demands. So in terms of New South Wales approach, similar, I guess, in the priorities for allocation to Victoria and others, town water supply, domestic and stock get the highest priority. Then there's high security entitlements, which are a relatively smaller component of the entitlement pool in New South Wales than they are in Victoria. Then there's conveyance water in irrigation delivery, gravity irrigation and piped irrigation systems. And then the largest chunk of entitlement, general security, gets allocations once those other entitlements have been satisfied. All of those rules are in their water sharing plans, which is the New South Wales sort of legal instrument that's the equivalent of Victorian bulk entitlements. So they're all set out there and there's plenty of explanations on how their allocation process works there at the Department of Planning and Environment website there, which is industry.newsouthwales.gov.au. Just follow the prompts to through the water section into the allocations and availability tabs, and you'll find lots of stuff there. Some of the products that the New South Wales resource managers put out are quite similar or use the same sort of themes as Victoria. And I guess that's a reflection of these are tools that the community said are helpful to them and give them some useful information. So you can see New South Wales produces very similar water balance type diagrams and shows where their relative commitments are and what the water available to meet those commitments might be. They also have a very good dashboard which will show their allocations across the year, and you can put multiple years together on that dashboard, and it'll tell you how what's the carryover balance at the start of the year and what's the cumulative allocation throughout the year. So there's a lot of information there at that allocations dashboard. In New South Wales, as I said, in Victoria, Golden Murray Water is the North Victorian resource manager and make the seasonal determinations. In New South Wales, DPE Water is responsible for making the available water determinations. So they're the guys to look to for information. Let's turn to South Australia. Their water allocation framework is similar, but has some key differences. So this shows what are the commitments and the water available. You can see the South Australian entitlement, which is a fixed entitlement, which is highly reliable, and totals across the year 1850 GL, which is composed of 696 gigalitres of dilution and loss, which is the first part of their entitlement available. And then there are 12, and that's made out into monthly parcels of 58 gigs a month. And then on top of that, there is monthly entitlement to water, which sums up across the year to 1154 GL. And when that is fully available, all of the South Australian entitlements can be fully met. So that's a pretty easy allocation decision when the entitlement is fully available. If there is restrictions on the South Australian entitlement due to dry conditions, and that in the sort of relatively rare years when that can't be met, or before it's fully available, at the start, if it's not fully available at the start of the year, this is the schema that South Australia follows. So again, you've got those dilution and losses, and they're allocated to some small portions to environment, wetlands, and dilution and loss flows. A reduced amount available instead of 150 GL, a reduced amounts available to Metro Adelaide, and obviously this is the sorts of periods when they'll be thinking about the role and use of their desal plan. Then there's next off the rank is some water for these what they call class 1, 2, 5, and 5, which are stock and domestic, country, town, urbans, and industrial and dairy washdown water. And then following that, we get to the general high security irrigation and environmental entitlements. And you can see there that there's a bit of a gradation saying that if there's, if this priority 3 bucket has 846 GL, there's 2% across all of those, and so on, increasing until it gets to 1496 when those will also be fully available. It also includes the available water for South Australia. It's the dilution and loss entitlements, as we said, and that dilution and loss entitlement is important. It covers operating the river from the South Australian border to Wellington, and then the consumptive entitlement goes on top of that. It's also included in the water available is any water that's been traded to South Australia from other systems but not delivered and is owed to South Australia. And the other area that South Australia now can call on, which was introduced after the Millennium Drought, was the South Australian storage right, where they can defer some of their monthly entitlement flows if they feel that they have enough water and don't need the full entitlement flow in any month. And that can be stored in the shared MDBA storages if there's available airspace. And then South Australia is able to call on that water later and to meet their needs or to use it. And particularly it's that storage right is targeted at giving them some form of reserve that will allow them to meet critical human water needs in extreme conditions, and also a measure of flexibility to offer some limited private carryover to their irrigation water users. In South Australia, the rules are set out in a document called the Water Allocation Plan, and that's also available, as you can see there, at the South Australian Landscape Board's website. That's the South Australian River Murray Landscape Board, and South Australian Department of Environment and Water make the seasonal allocations in accordance with the rules that are set out in that water allocation plan. So let's just take a little bit of a look at how water allocation is played out in this 21-22 season. So you might have recalled, if you joined in for the previous webinar, this is a table we looked at with where all the water entitlements that are on issue. And let's just look a bit at some of the big chunks, which we'll look at a little bit further in the next couple of slides. So you can see that the big volumes of water are tied up in high reliability above the choke, New South Wales General Security above the choke, a very large pool of entitlement there. Then Murray, Victorian high reliability downstream of the choke, another a big entitlement pool, and also some smaller volumes there in Murray General Security, but still significant, and quite a limited amount of Murray High Security. We've got those South Australian high security entitlements, and then similarly in the Goulburn, there's a lot of water tied up in high reliability watersheds in the Goulburn, and only about half of that amount is low reliability watershed entitlements. And as you can see, similarly on the Murrumbidgee, the bulk of the water is assigned around general security entitlements in the Murrumbidgee. So let's see how some of those major entitlement classes performed over 2021. So here we have a plot, and there's a few lines on there, so sorry if it's a bit busy, but let's just step through it. The first chart here, this grey line, is the Goulburn high reliability watersheds. This blue line here, this darker blue line, is the Victorian Murray high reliability watersheds. And you can see that moving up, going up quite nicely through July, slowing down a little bit through August, and then taking off again in September, as did the Goulburn high reliability watersheds. So they both reached the maximum 100% allocation here in about late September, in September, October. You can see in the green line there is the South Australian Murray high security entitlements, and they started at 100% and obviously stayed there the whole season. So great certainty for South Australian water users there. So let's now turn to what happened in New South Wales with their general security entitlements. So this lighter blue line is the Murrumbidgee general security, started to rise with inflows, and then there was a bit of a flat period here right through until October, and then it took off again and quite rapidly rose through into the maximum of 100% availability there. This yellow line is the New South Wales Murray General Security line. You can see it's some good, it started off quite low, and that's obviously the approach in New South Wales is that they seek to allocate as much water available in the current year and have less of a focus, certainly for general security, aren't focused on year two. So allocations can be more variable, but often offer higher volumes when water availability is good. There are higher allocations, and when there's restricted, there's not as much in reserve to cover general security entitlements in New South Wales, so they can experience lower allocations. You can see it took off quite well, flattened out here at about 30% for a little while, and we'll cover that a bit later, and then took off again in September and then rose quite rapidly through to the maximum of 110% that's allowable under the water sharing plan in New South Wales. This last trace is the Victorian Murray low reliability watershed, and you'll see that high reliability watersheds in early October reached 100%. Then there was a bit of a gap until early December when we started to take off throughout December, and there was allocations to low reliability watersheds announced. And that was that period where they're building reserves for next year, for high reliability watersheds and some operating waters to get started next year. So when that was put away in storage, low reliability watersheds could start to be allocated, and they took off very quickly. And as you can see, from starting in mid-December, they moved very quickly. By late February, they were at maximum 100% allocation against low reliability watersheds. All states have adopted the same sort of approach to the frequency of their announcements. They'll review their seasonal allocations throughout the water year, and particularly when you're below the maximum initial target allocations, states review their seasonal allocations on the 1st and the 15th of the month, or the next business day after that, if it's a holiday or weekend, and they announce the outcomes to the market. So that there's a regular, consistent flow of information, even if that information is no change. Once 100% of high reliability of May or maximum allocations are reached, there might be a slowing down, and there'll be allocation announcements may move back to the only occurring on the 15th of the month in those situations. Now, we've had a look at what the shape of these curves were for Goulburn and for the Murray, and what happened. Let's look at how that links up to the inflows that were generated in the water to make that all happen. So here's the Murray inflows, and you might recall this from the previous webinar. But what this is showing is the blue line is the 21-22 inflows, and you note the black line is the long-term average, and also the green line is the 10-year average, purple line being the 2021 previous season. So you can see much better inflows than previous seasons or recent 10-year averages, back to something a little more like the long-term historic averages. So good water availability over that spring, winter-spring inflow period, and that was what was driving those increases we saw certainly across September. You can see inflows dropped back a little in August, and that was that slowing down in the increases we saw, and then they picked up again in September. And here we can see November, December, well above long-term average, and very good inflows continuing into December and January. And this was the chunk of water here that was driving low reliability water share allocations in the Murray. For the Goulburn, similar story. You can see the teal coloured bars here, the actual inflows for 21-22, and that's compared to long-term averages, or the wet scenario there in the blue upper line, or dry scenario there in the yellow in the orange line. So you can see we had some really good above average inflows there in July, kicking things off nicely. Slowed down a bit in August, as it did in the Murray, and then picked up a bit with some higher inflows experienced, significantly above average in September, and fueled some of those rises, took us to 100% of high reliability water shares by October. But as you can see here, inflows dropped back significantly to quite low levels, and so we didn't catch up there and accumulate enough reserves towards next year 2 high reliability water shares, a base for that, or some of the base for the operating water needed. So the resource manager wasn't able to move in and start allocating low reliability water shares in the Goulburn in the current season. So there are a range of plots for these sorts of plots on the Northern Victorian Resource Manager website. So lots of information there if you want to grab that and have a look at what's going on, and they're regularly updated. So encourage you to have a look at that and get show you some of the drivers that are sitting behind what's driving allocation and what's helping to make water availability change. So that's where we've got to, and that's as far as we want to go at the moment on seasonal allocations and the processes. Let's touch quickly on a couple of other issues before we open it up for some further questions. And don't forget, if you have a question, feel free to pop that into the chat and we'll get to that. Let's turn now to, we've talked about seasonal allocations, and once water is allocated, here it goes. Entitlement holders have the option to think about carryover. So let's talk a little bit about carryover, and we'll start with a Victorian perspective. Carryover was introduced in 2007, and it was introduced at the time as a temporary drought response, and that was, if you'll recall, that was right at the depths of the Millennium Drought when things were were pretty dire. It proved pretty effective, and it was made permanent in December 2007. The rules were reviewed through the Northern Regional Sustainable Water Strategy, which was developed over 2008 and released in 2009. There was some tweaking of those, some upper limits on the carryover started reasonably conservatively. The upper limits on carryover volumes were increased in 2009. And then we had spillable water accounts introduced in 2010-11 for the Campaspe, Goulburn and Murray. And there was a further review in 2012 that refined the rules and tweaked them a bit, although they were substantially the same. So let's look at what those rules are now for Victorian carryover and spillable water accounts on the Campaspe, Goulburn and Murray. So water in an allocation account can be carried over to the next season at the end of the year, but that allocation account needs to be linked to a water share. So you can't access carryover unless you own a water share, which is really you're an entitlement holder and you're contributing the cost of maintaining and operating and managing those storages that provide the opportunities to carry that water over. You can carry over up to 100% of the water share volume. The volume of your water share entitlement can be carried over from one season into the next, so that you've got some water there for use or trade at the start of the season. And the volume carried over will attract a 5% deduction, which accounts for the extra evaporation loss that occurs as that water sits there as additional water that wouldn't have otherwise been there if it had been used when in the year it was allocated. It's creating just a tiny bit more evaporation losses in the storage, so there's a bit of a deduction there so that others aren't worse off as a result of that carryover decision by the individual. So carryover or allocation, as allocations rise, the carryover or allocation, I guess, in your entitlement bucket can't be more than 100% of the water share volume. So if the sum of the carryover that you brought in and your at the start of the year and the allocation that's been made, new allocations made exceeds 100%, that water above 100% of your entitlement volume is moved into a spillable water account. And that spillable water account's only available to be accessed and used once the resource manager declares that there's a low risk of spill. And if we don't reach that point, if the dam does spill, the volumes of those spills are deducted from spillable water accounts, hence their name. So really what that means is that spillable water accounts, in effect, you've used the notional bucket that's the size of your water entitlement. And so any water above that is really borrowing available airspace that would normally be used to store water for other entitlement holders. So you're able to use that while it's empty and put spillable water into it. But as new inflows occur and that airspace is filled, the spillable water account's water can spill out for the dam to make way for those new inflows that are allocated to all entitlement holders. So a couple of the important things to remember about carryover is carryover doesn't change the amount of water available. The amount of water available is dictated by rainfall, inflows and usage. But what it does do is moves around between years and also changes how it might be distributed between individual users, depending on whether it's used in one year or carried over to another year, or in some cases, some people may elect, if they don't have a water share, any water allocation in their account at the end of the year is forfeited and returned to the communal pool as a basis for the new season's allocations. So it has changed some of that. We know that it's been a great tool to provide water, particularly to make sure that there is an option to have some water in very dry years and at start of seasons when there might be limited allocation available. And also it gives people a way to manage their risk in conjunction with other tools like using the water market. But what we have seen is what we did see before carryover, that in those dry years, the utilisation of entitlements was very high. So that water would have been that water that might be carried over would have otherwise been used. And really, the question is now it gives the option for water users to decide: do I use the water now in autumn before I would have had to surrender it and lose it at the end of the water year in the old system, or can I choose to hang on to it and maybe use it in the spring of the next season where I might get a better return. So those are the choices and the opportunities that carryover offers. So let's have a quick look, think about what happens in other states. New South Wales, carryover, in Victoria, carryover is available if you have a high reliability watershed or a low reliability watershed. Both those products offer carryover ability. In New South Wales, though, carryover is only available on general security entitlements. Carryover limit there is 0.5 megalitres per share, rather than, so 50% rather than the Victorian 100%. And the limit for available water determination, so allocation plus carryover, can't exceed 110% of the general security licence volume. And there's slightly different rules, but similar on the Murrumbidgee. They don't make deductions for evaporation, and there are no spillable water accounts. So if the sum of, as allocations rise, the carryover you brought in plus the allocation is higher than 110% of your general security entitlement volume, that water is forfeited and not available, and returns to the and goes back into the general pool for allocation. In South Australia, they've got a very different product, which is relatively new for them, and carryover is not offered every year in South Australia to high security entitlement holders. It's only offered when the Department of Environment and Water publishes an April outlook every year. And when that April outlook projects the minimum opening water allocation will be 50% or less, carryovers available. So at that time, water users can choose, and they'll have some sort of indications about how the season's shaping. They can carry over up to 20% of their entitlement volume. And similarly to Victoria and New South Wales, there are limits on the carryover plus allocation limits. And in South Australia, carryover plus allocation can't exceed 100% of the entitlement volume. If conditions do improve after carryover has been announced and allocations, they might start low but subsequently increase to 100% later in the year, the volume above 100%, the sum of the allocation plus carryover, is spilled into a rollover account. And if the next water year opens at 50% or less, irrigators can access that rollover volume. So as we said earlier, the ability to carry over against private individual entitlements in South Australia is based on the South Australian storage right and water that's deferred in there, and also the volumes of undelivered trade from upstream that haven't been delivered at 30th of June and are owed to South Australia. So, but if those volumes are limited and can't cover the full volume of carryover that might have been put away, access to individual carryovers might be reduced in those cases in South Australia. So as you can see, there's some similar basics across all of them, but the Victorian carryover product does offer quite a bit more flexibility with spillable water accounts, although there are some restrictions on spillable water accounts, and with its availability on both high reliability and low reliability water shares, it probably looks like one of the better carryover products out there, and is proved to be pretty popular in the market. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the water held. This is a water ownership information which is available for all Northern Victorian water systems on the Northern Victorian Resource Manager site. There's also similar information available on the Victorian Water Register. So let's just focus on the carryover components there. This was carryover at the start of the year, and you can see that it's split up into private carryover and carryover for environmental entitlements and also for water corporations. But let's just worry about the private carryover, which is the biggest chunk. And you can see there, and consistently in 2020, 21-22, those starting carryover volumes were about 40% higher for private carryover and for environmental carryover than they had been at the start of the carryover volumes that started out in the 2021 water year. So quite a lot more water came into 21-22. We had good additional allocations, and you can see there what was happening. No water was returned from spillable water accounts. And this is on the Murray, I might add. This example is the Murray. And we can see here what's gone out of those accounts. So this was water as allocations, as these new allocations were made, water that was transferred into spillable water accounts because the limit on on a normal account is 100%. Once the allocation reached 100%, all of that water was transferred into spillable water accounts that came in as carryover. And you can see there that this is what's happened. That's the water available in allocation accounts now after use. This is the water in spillable accounts. So you can see large quantities of water have spilled from both the environment and from private carryover accounts. And you can see those numbers there, over 400 GL from private accounts and nearly 200 GL from environmental accounts. So a large amount of water is spilled from those accounts. Should note also that this was as at the 2nd of June, but any water in spillable water accounts on as at the 10th of June, the resource manager has announced that that water will be returned to normal allocation accounts. So effectively, that's equivalent to a low risk of spill being declared on the 10th of June, and that water will be available in allocation accounts, and then people can decide what to do, whether to carry over, whether to offer it onto the market, or organise their portfolio management for the end of the year. Let's have a quick look at some of the key difference between water in an allocation account and water in a spillable water account. So clearly, water in an allocation account is secure storage of the current allocations and any carryover that's in there. It can't spill, and it's available for use and trade at any time, which is important, but there is that limit we spoke about. Water in the spillable water account is really, it's opportunistic storage of additional water. As we said, it's in that sort of borrowing airspace from someone else. And it only happens if the carryover plus allocation in the allocation account exceeds 100%. And it can be lost when the storage spills, and it can't be used until there's a low risk of spill declaration. And when that happens, it's automatically transferred into the linked allocation account for use or trade. Okay, so lots in the carryover space, but some of the important things to think about carryover, it is a really important risk management tool for irrigators, and combining that with trade. But some of the issues to consider when you're planning carryover, it's what's the outlook for allocations next season? What's the climate outlook for the prospects of further increase? And climate outlook will play to what might water availability be, and what might be water demand for your crops in terms of what might be met from rain versus what will need to be met from irrigation. Those things will all play into also assessments of what's the price for allocation trade in the next season, which is the other option if you choose not to carry over water and you need water that you haven't had allocated yet. And the other question about carryover is, do you need water early in the season? And if water allocations are low, is carryover an option to give you a little bit of a bridge there to get started? The other options are parking opportunities, where water can be transferred to another entitlement holder who may not wish to carry over and is prepared to hold that allocation, carry over against their entitlement, and then transfer it back to you. Those are all private contracts, but it's widely practiced. So a couple of things to think about, and one of the things is that you can't really use the same strategy every year. You really need to adapt and think about those issues each year, and think about what's the value of carryover water to your business. It offers a really important insurance policy, and what's the sort of risks that you can tolerate, and what's it worth investing to manage those risks in carryover or purchase of allocation next season, or both. And remember that if spillable water accounts do spill, water availability will be high, and allocation prices at that time are likely to be quite low. And we've certainly seen that this year. So parking and carryover is an option, as I said, and there's lots of opportunities there, but they need to be carefully thought through as well. Particularly if you're thinking about parking water in a different system, you may encounter some trade limits in trying to get that transferred back to you in the next season. We've talked about spillable water accounts, so let's quickly talk about dam spills and what that means. I'm in charge of stating the obvious here. So it has been wet. So there have been lots of spills or pre-releases, which are releases where operators might not let the water get to the level where it goes over the spillway, but they're certain it would have been, so they release it through the outlet works, or release a little ahead of the inflows to create some airspace so they can can provide a measure of flood mitigation downstream of the storage. So we've been seeing that across Hume, the Murrumbidgee storages, and at the Mindy Lakes for much of the year. All of those storages are currently sitting above 90%. Eildon is at 78%, so that's one to watch during winter and spring. If it continues to climb, we might be seeing some pre-release and spill activity at Eildon. So the important thing to remember is that physical spills or airspace management pre-releases to create airspace when it's clear that the storage would have filled, those volumes are treated as a spill, and they can affect a range of spillable water accounts. So let's look at what those are. So in the Murray, particularly around focusing on Lake Hume, if there's a physical spill at Lake Hume, water spills, there's a number of spillable water accounts, and this is what the order they spill in. Generally, South Australian Storage Right is the very first to spill. Then River Murray Improved Flows will spill, which is, if that's the water that's spillable component of that entitlement, which is an environmental entitlement created through snowy water savings. Then we get the Barmah Mineral Forest Environmental Water Account carryover, and then the current year allocation spill, if these ones are all spilled and there's continuing spills, and then individual spillable water accounts. On the Murray, though, with the shared storage, and we talked in the last webinar about the issue around internal spills. So if water's spilling out of Victoria's half share of Lake Hume into New South Wales' share, spillable water accounts will also spill, because that means that there is no scope to hold any additional inflows. So the same principle applies there. So those spillable water accounts will also spill when there's an internal spill in Lake Hume. On the Goulburn, there's a few spillable accounts. There's the passing flow account, the inter-valley transfer volume, which is carried over if it's carried over from a previous year. That's traded water that might be owed from previous years that can spill. There's extended use accounts for the Living Murray environmental entitlements and individual spillable water accounts. Now, all of those accounts are debited pro rata at the same time. So the volume of the spill is assessed, and that's taken off proportionally across all of those accounts at the same time. So if we're thinking about spills, they really often lead to a phenomenon that we call unregulated flows. So that's flows that can't be stored or used upstream of the South Australian border. So in the River Murray system, it's a flow which hasn't been planned by the authority, is how they technically define it, and that's water they can't harvest into a storage, particularly Lake Victoria, which is the last storage available, or can't be used to meet state entitlements, such as South Australian entitlements under the agreement. Unregulated flows can be created from spills from upstream storages, either or in combination with tributary inflows, or potentially even tributary inflows alone. So MDBA announced those unregulated conditions, and they'll be for a defined period, and they'll be regularly reviewed before they're expired, and they may be extended or they may not be, depending on the river conditions. And they don't have to apply across the whole river at the same time. And the MDBA do report every week in their weekly reports on unregulated flow conditions. So in 2021, we've seen large periods of unregulated flow conditions. We had unreg flows commencing in mid-July 2021, and they've applied continuously since throughout the whole water year downstream of the Murrumbidgee River confluence. And we noted earlier there've been a lot of spills and pre-releases from the Murrumbidgee storages, which have been feeding that reach of the river as well. And there's also been frequent periods of unregulated conditions from Hume through down to the Murrumbidgee junction as well. So lots of unregulated flow opportunities this year. So that takes us to thinking about supplementary water use, which is a class of licences in New South Wales, supplementary licences. They allow access to flows that can't be captured or re-regulated into storages. So there is an upper limiting volume that can be taken under each of those licences, but it can only be taken if the opportunity is announced by Water New South Wales. So it's an event-based opportunistic licence. In some years, there are no opportunities to take any water under those licences if there's no unregulated flow periods. So Water New South Wales makes an assessment of that, and they need to determine whether the water available in the unregulated flow period is going to be enough or likely to be enough to meet the demands that might arise if supplementary access is announced. So they need to make an informed judgment as to whether it's possible to announce supplementary access. But in the Murray system, there's no announcement of supplementary access unless the MDBA has announced unregulated conditions first. Victoria, for people who've been around for a while, might recall that Victoria did have a similar option. It was called off quota in the past, but it was relatively rarely used given the high reliability of Victorian entitlements and the different types of irrigation practiced in Victoria compared to New South Wales. And it was agreed to be phased out in the 1990s as part of the development of bulk entitlements. And really some of the key drivers for that decision was that it protected, once the Murray-Darling Basin cap on diversions was introduced and the sustainable diversion limits followed them, it protected the reliability of high reliability water entitlements, water rights and watersheds. Once you had a cap and there was limits on those, the more you took under off quota, the less was available for those high reliability entitlements. And water users agreed that protecting those reliability, given the very small amount of off quota, it was better to not encourage use of that and make sure that those valuable entitlements reliability was protected rather than eroded. Let's turn to UCF, which is not some form of mixed martial arts. It's uncontrolled flow access in New South Wales. So when supplementary is announced, other licence holders can, of course, take water as normal during supplementary flows, but in recognition of the fact that New South Wales general security licences are less reliable, they're not a high security licence. If there is supplementary flow, those general security licence holders can also access this uncontrolled flow during those supplementary events. It's also been called without debit water in some parts in the past. General security licence holders are only allowed to access this opportunity when the available water determinations are less than 60%. And the upper limit is what do they take under? Think of it as an advance on possible future allocation increases for general security. So that uncontrolled flow use plus the available water determinations plus the carryover can't exceed 100% of the general security licence volume. So once the annual available water determination goes above 60%, that without debit water is actually brought to account and it converts to water and is debited to their account in the normal way and just seen as water that was taken early in advance of the allocation. Irrigators need to then live within the overall limits that apply to their account. So we've covered a lot of ground there. So let's just summarise what that is, where we've gone to. So seasonal determinations or seasonal allocations are the key process that shares the available water between individual entitlement holders. And as we've seen, there are some pretty similar general principles applying in all states, but the details can vary due to the different water products and the different water sharing rules. So that's really important. The other thing I would say to you is that thinking about all of those things that we looked at, what are the commitments that need to be met, including trade and water owed between systems and carryover and the levels of usage. Individuals can't figure it out by looking at the dam levels. You need to look at the advice and outlooks provided by the resource managers. They are your best guide to what might happen with seasonal allocations. Complementing seasonal allocations, carryover is another important risk management tool, but it needs to be carefully planned. So there are some risks as well as opportunities with carryover, and there are a lot of different approaches, and as we've seen, a range of carryover products across the Southern Murray-Darling Basin. So you might want to think about which product suits your needs best. The other thing I'd say, when we look at all this, there is a huge amount of information on the Resource Manager websites if you want to go and look at those. So that's the Northern Victorian Resource Manager, the Victorian Water Register website, the DPE Water website in New South Wales, and the South Australian DEW website. So look at those if you want to get some more information to help you understand and manage your water portfolio and plan how you can best meet your water needs. That information is really useful and helpful. So let's pause there. Rob, do we have any questions?
We do have a few questions, Gary. The first one here is, why isn't the 1st of July outlook for 100% high reliability water allocation, given there's so much water about in the lakes?
Okay, yeah, good question. And that goes back to my point. I think that you can't tell from looking at the dam anymore because it's what's that water flows, how much is owed to other systems, how much water might go into carryover that's not available for allocation because it's already been allocated once. It might become available through trade. So that's the reasons why. And some of the factor, and we saw that there's some factors at low allocations. New South Wales and Victoria they have the Barmah Mill Forest environmental water allocations. They can borrow that water to support allocations that when they're at low allocation levels, but once allocations rise, they're higher levels and they need to be paid back. So sometimes it's about water that's paying back those borrows, which help support irrigation allocations. So there's a range of reasons why you can't quite tell from that. And also there's lots of water around, but if it's not being used, if there's no demand at the time, it's not used. It's not reducing the water that's the usage that's unused water sitting in accounts. So if storages are full and water's not being used, there's no ability to store additional water. So there's a range of issues why there might be a bit of a pause in allocations or low starts. But it usually shakes out quite quickly and people will get a clear view of what's happening within the first couple of months of the season.
Thanks, Gary. And I think this next question relates to the graph that you were putting up with the different availability of the Southern Basin entitlements over time this year. So the question is, do the different Southern Basin irrigation entitlement types tend to fill in the same order each year?
Look, they do have that. Within each state, there is a fixed hierarchy that we talk through. So it's always high security first, and sometimes that'll be urbans up there with it. DNS and basic landholder rights are usually the very first one. Then you'll have high security, then those lower security or general security. And the last of all is the supplementary. And I should also mention in terms of supplementary, if, for example, in New South Wales, if they were getting close to the water use limits that are specified, their long-term water use limits that are specified in the water sharing plans or under the sustainable diversion limit, supplementary would be the first area they would cut back and limit access to supplementary to make sure that their use stayed within those limits.
Thanks, Gary. Another question. Given the probability of losing carryover with the high risk of spill at the moment, do you think there will be a water price spike on the 1st of July?
Look, it's a really good question. We're going to delve into that a bit more at the next webinar. But look, let's reflect on the fact that right now what are water prices doing, and they're quite low. And I don't think there'll be a sudden change because we've got a climate outlook of continuing, a high probability of above median rainfall. So I don't think we'll see a huge spike, but that depends a little bit on how the season unfolds. But there's going to be high water availability, as the outlooks are saying. So I think it's something that's a bit of a wait and see.
Great. Yep.
I've got a question here, Rob. Someone's asked me a question on my chat. They've asked, when new entitlements are made, is the bulk entitlement or cap increased to fit, and how does this impact existing entitlement reliabilities? For example, connection savings recently given out. Great question. The answer is that those savings are created by developing systems that are more efficient. In this case, this is loss allowances in irrigation districts provided those savings. So what happens is, as those new entitlements are created and given out at the same time, the area that they were saved from, the district loss allowances, are reduced by the equivalent amount. So there's a net zero, there's no increase in commitments, so it doesn't affect the reliability of existing entitlements. And that's one of the very important issues that's foremost when water savings are being assessed and accredited.
Great. I've got another question here from John, Gary. You mentioned Victoria takes a 2-year outlook into consideration when deciding on allocation levels. Is this different to New South Wales? And does this make Victorian allocations effectively less volatile?
Yeah, that's right. It does. Victoria has really focused on high reliability water shares as the bulk of where the bulk of the water is committed, and that's a view to making it available, really reliable. That means you need to put water away in advance so that you've got reserves for the next year. General security, a similar approach applies in New South Wales, but they've got much less water tied up in their high security entitlements. So most of their water is in general security. They'll allocate the maximum water available with very little reserve for the following year against general security. It relies on inflows in the next year. And that's why we've seen some very low general security announcements that haven't picked up in some of those, particularly pre-2020, where there's a series of dry years. And that was to reflect that. But when they're available, a lot of water is available on general security. And overall, water use under general security is somewhat higher because when the water's there, it's made available. Whereas sometimes in Victoria, there will be more spills because you've got more in reserve to create a reliable product, but the overall entitlements on issue and the water use is a little lower to provide that reliability.
Thanks, Garry. Another question here, does Victoria have a Barmah-Millewa account to pay back like what New South Wales has? And if so, how many gigalitres is allocated to the forest in comparison to New South Wales?
Okay, so Barmah-Millewa, really good question. Barmah-Millewa is Barmah-Millewa is a really good case. The water available to the Barmah-Millewa account is provided equally by Victoria and New South Wales always, and there's borrowing arrangements which are slightly different. They're the same principle, but there's a target allocation. You can borrow if your state's below the target allocation. When you reach that target allocation, you need to pay back before you can make further allocations. In New South Wales, that target allocation is 30% of general security. And people might recall from the graph, that was the flat part of the graph on New South Wales general security allocation. It's flatlined at 30% for a month or two while that borrowing was being paid back, and then it took off again. In Victoria, that target allocation is 100% of high reliability. And you'll recall we hit 100% of high reliability on the Murray in about October. There was a gap then building reserves, paying back Barmah-Millewa borrows. All of those things were all happening until we started to. So once they were done, we could start to allocate additional inflows to low reliability water shares in December. So yes, the paybacks all happened, and certainly at these high levels, once you pass those target allocation levels, it needs to be paid back before further allocations are made.
Thanks, Garry. And one last question. Why doesn't Victoria have supplementary water use like New South Wales?
Well, I hope I covered that in the discussion, but basically Victoria's focused on high reliability entitlements. So some of the issues there are that there's generally quite good allocations available. It was a much smaller component of water use, so it was better to take it out, because an increase, if that was to increase, that would put at risk the reliability of high security, high reliability water shares. And so, but on the other side, general security, as we said, is a bit more volatile. And if you were going to have a low allocation, or if there was no allocation in general security, supplementary allocation, if there was a flush down the river that was declared, you could get some water. And it particularly suited the enterprises there where people might have off-farm storages, or particularly rice growing, where you've got effectively a whole lot of rice paddies or ponds that you want to fill up at some time if water's there, that can really bridge over and keep you going. So it was really a reflection of the different needs and water use needs of each state, and the different entitlement structures that water users said were important to them.
Thanks, Garry. That's it for the questions. I'm just aware that it's 10 minutes past 2, so I think we'll wrap it up. Thanks for a great presentation again and clarifying some of those issues around the bigger southern basin. Thanks to John for working behind the scenes and keeping the show afloat. And thanks especially to all the participants who have supported us and for your contributions. I hope you've got some value out of today's session. Just a reminder, if you could complete that survey on the screen, that would be a big help. And I look forward to catching up with people at the next webinar on the 24th of June. So thanks very much and have a good afternoon.